Welcome everyone to the Western Museum of Flight. I'm Cindy Maka, the director. We have today one of the foremost experts on the origin of America's manned space exploration. Through many years as a researcher and author, and who was the founder of Mach 25 Media, she has certainly earned her wings in this subject. And Michelle is an Air Force veteran. Her award-winning book, The X-15 rocket plane flying the first wings into space, has won many accolades. And so, ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to introduce Michelle Evans.
Thank you so much for having me here today. It's really wonderful. Thank you for Cindy and for everybody here at the Western Museum of Flight. This is the third time I've been here, and it's just been amazing, and I really appreciate being able to have the opportunity to come back and speak with you all again. This is a bit of a different type of a story for me today. I've told the story about the X-15 rocket plane itself, and I came in and talked about Mike Adams, one of the pilots, and today I'm going to share with you my personal journey with regard to the X-15. So before we get started, I wanted to make sure also to say that I want to dedicate this talk to two very special people. One is Charlie Baker, who was the X-15 number 3 crew chief, and he just passed away like 2 weeks ago. So I wanted to recognize Charlie, and also especially for pilot Joe Engel. He was the final X-15 pilot to be with us, and he died back in July. I'm actually going to Arlington for his memorial service in March, and I definitely want to dedicate this both to Joe and to Charlie. So thank you so much for having me here today. So with that, we'll get started here, and everything is up and running. Thank you for being here today. I wrote a book about the highest and fastest research aircraft to ever take to the skies. It's entitled The X-15 Rocket Plane Flying the First Wings into Space. Now, normally I'd be speaking about the content of the book, the X-15 itself, and the people who made it all happen. However, today I will instead be talking to you about my personal journey, about why the book was written, how it all happened to bring this book into existence. This is my adventures with the X-15 rocket plane. My journey started when I was in kindergarten, and I first became fascinated with the idea of writing a book. I was amazed every time that my teacher would transport us across time and space by simply reading. In those days, we were not taught to read until the first grade, so I would look at the book she held and wonder at how these tiny words inside could do such miraculous things. I wanted to be able to do that myself. At the same time, my father worked for a company called Sangamo Electric, setting up expensive multi-track data tape recorders at government locales such as the Naval Weapons Center at China Lake and also the Flight Research Center at Edwards Air Force Base in California's Mojave Desert. His instruments acquired telemetry from military tests of aircraft, missiles, and other weapon systems. Most of what he did, he could not talk to me about. But one morning before going to school, my father asked if I'd like to tag along on one of his trips up to Edwards, and I jumped at the chance. Although for a 5-year-old kid, it was a scary proposition to head into the desert with aircraft of every sort under the sun thundering through the bright sky. I waited at the curb outside my classroom at the appointed time for my father to pick me up and begin my first adventure, one that eventually changed my life. The trepidation of that first trip quickly turned to awe as I saw the wonders in store. It was the first of many such excursions over the next several years. This was the dawn of the era of spaceflight, when we could go everywhere and do everything. The moon was within our grasp. The rockets being launched at Cape Canaveral were wonderful and exciting, but I saw them only on television. Whereas on these trips to the other NASA up at Edwards, I could see the real vehicles up close. I also had a young child's delight in getting to meet the people who flew the test flights and lots of others on the ground who truly made it all happen. Since my father also had work to do, he often found a friend who could walk me around on behind-the-scenes tours, through the hangars and out on the flight line to see what was on the ramp being prepared for a future flight, or what might have just come back from a sortie. I vividly recall watching with fascination as the X-15 was slung under the wing of a B-52 mothership and made ready for flight. There was so much going on, the jumble of equipment, personnel going about their jobs, everyone often doing things where I had no idea of their purpose. It was paradise for a curious kid with lots of questions and a yearning for excitement. On one such trip, my father's friend decided to take me to see the X-15 simulator, known as the Iron Bird. He knew it was in use and thought I might like to see it in operation. It was a long contraption with pipes and wires and sheet metal, looking like something a child such as myself might cobble together out of an erector set. We stood and watched for a bit, then the pilot finished his mission and exited the cockpit. And instead of walking away to some debriefing or to his office, he saw me and decided to come over and say hello. I have no idea who my guide was that day, but I will always remember that moment when he introduced me to the X-15 research pilot who had just exited the simulator. His name was Neil Armstrong. We also returned for the annual Edwards Air Show, and I always loved checking out these exciting aircraft. In school, I kept the dream alive about someday writing my book, but I had no idea that eventually my passion for writing would intersect with my fascination with the X-15. I spent several years taking journalism classes in junior high and high school, but when it came time to face the reality of college, I knew I had no money to pursue that goal. Because of that, my life took a major turn as I decided to join the U.S. Air Force. I figured I would learn some great skills and also be able to pay for my college as I served. My father was an aerospace engineer, and I never figured I would follow in his footsteps. I saw that as being a long ways from my goal of becoming a writer. Yet there I was working on nuclear missile systems, and yes, I'm actually sitting on a nuke right there, but we won't talk about that. And I worked there for 8 years on the Air Force. At one point, I felt I would make the military my career, but for various reasons, after I finished my degree, I eventually decided to go out on my own and return home to California. At that point, I went into vibration, shock, and acoustic testing for the aerospace industry for the next dozen years. However, less than 3 years out of the military, with my career going well, the idea of pursuing my original goal as a writer started to gnaw at me again. The final push came suddenly on the 21st of September of 1983. I'm OCD, so I remember all these dates and things. I was writing the preface for a book on experimental aircraft. In it, the author talked about how his book was just an overview of all of these X-plane programs, and that many of these aircraft he wrote of deserved full books on their own. It was like lightning had struck as everything finally fell into place. As a kid, I'd been fascinated with the X-15 research aircraft because of those trips up to Edwards with my dad. All that came flooding back to me as I read that author's statement. And it dawned on me that I had the perfect subject for my book, the X-15 rocket plane. The next morning, I called the Edwards History Office and I spoke with Dr. Richard Hallian. I spent hours going through files and photographs and spoke with him about my intended project. He mentioned that X-15 pilot Milt Thompson was currently the chief engineer at Edwards at NASA Dryden, and asked if I'd like to do an interview with him. I was definitely not ready to do an interview that day, as Cherie would attest to, but I'm certainly not going to turn it down, so I said, of course, sure, I'm ready to go. He called Milt, who agreed to the interview, and we headed over to the NASA facility a mile or so from that history office. We sat with Milt and had a wonderful interview. At one point, Milt called in one of his best friends, Jack Koff, from the office next door. Jack was a flight planner on the X-15 project, and between the two of them, Cherie and I had an enlightening and fun afternoon talking about the X-15. From that first interview, things expanded quickly as I connected with other pilots who were still alive, as well as others associated with the program. There were 12 pilots, and 9 of them were still with us at that time. Joe Walker, Jack McKay, and Mike Adams were gone, but I had hopes of connecting with members of their families in order to tell their stories as well. The 9 X-15 pilots I was able to interview, besides Milt, were Scott Crossfield, Robert White, Forrest Peterson, Robert Rushworth, Neil Armstrong, Joe Engle, Pete Knight, and Bill Dana. Each was a unique experience. As an example, I contacted Neil Armstrong for an interview. After a couple of months of planning, I drove into a tiny Ohio town on a rainy Thursday afternoon in early May, looking for his office. I knocked on the door, and for a very long time, no one answered. Had he forgotten our appointment? Finally, the door creaked open, and a very old man was standing there. I thought maybe this was Neil's dad. When I said I was there to see Neil, he thought for a long moment. He scratched his head, and he said, "Oh, you must be looking for that astronaut fella." I told him I was. And he explained the address number that I had been given was wrong. It was off by a digit, and directed me down to the right location down the street. Soon after, I was knocking on the correct door, and his secretary answered, inviting me in out of the rain. Now, my first glimpse of Neil in his office that wet afternoon, the first time I'd seen him in person since that time on the X-15 simulator, was him standing there with a wastebasket in his hand, trying to place it to catch the rain coming in from his bad roof. There was more rain inside than there was outside that day. The can was just one of several that were scattered about the room. Neil set the can on the floor under a drip. Looking around the room at the mess, he suggested we find a new spot to go for our interview. So we walked across the street to a neighborhood ice cream parlor. We found a corner table near the front window and sat down to talk. And that's actually the place we had that meeting that day. I recall that meeting fondly and can now listen to that tape of his mild but assured voice answering my queries. In the background are various sounds of the parlor, chairs scratching on the floor, the cash register ringing up, the tinkling of the little bell at the doors that opened and closed as new people came in. This is just one of many vivid memories from all the interviews that I conducted for this book, part of my personal journey with regard to the X-15. Earlier on that same research trip to speak with Neil, I had an appointment in the suburbs of Virginia to see the only Navy pilot in the program, Forrest Peterson. Early Saturday morning, I was looking for his street when I recognized the entrance to the Central Intelligence Agency on my left. And just a few blocks later, I turned into the small cul-de-sac where Admiral Peterson lived. When he invited me in, I immediately saw it was going to be a very informal interview. He was wearing a light blue robe that was covered with cat hair. We conducted the interview at his kitchen table as his wife puttered around making us breakfast. Each interview was special. Joe Engle in a dimly lit sitting room with a porthole at the Queen Mary cruise ship up the street here in Long Beach. Scott Crossfield on a bench in the echoing hallways of the Rayburn Senate office building in Washington, D.C. Jack Koff and Milt Thompson at their desks at Dryden on Christmas Day with brownies that Cherie and I brought to share as we conducted another interview. Robert Rushworth with his doormat reading Aliens Welcome when we went to see him on my birthday. Pete Knight fielding phone calls as he was deciding whether to run for political office for the first time. And he kept getting phone calls so often while we were getting interrupted. So he finally just said, "Yes, I'll run for mayor of Palmdale. Just stop bugging me so we can finish the interview." 17 technicians and engineers from the X-15 program in a back room at a restaurant in Lancaster, speaking together of their X-15 exploits to keep each other honest, as they said. That was an amazing day to be there with all 17 guys in one room. Believe me, it was just something else. John Mateague proudly displaying a leftover rear X-15 landing skid in his living room. Jim Robertson talking of working on the external tanks, then pulling out numerous display cases of creepy and exotic bugs that he had collected from travels around the world. Jim Townsend becoming animated with X-15 stories just weeks before he passed away. Grace Walker and Frida Adams at opposite ends of the country, but both with mist in their eyes as they talked of their X-15 husbands, now long gone. In May of 2004, a breakthrough occurred in my research. An Eagle Scout candidate, John Badelsky, was tasked with creating a memorial to honor the only X-15 pilot lost in the line of duty, Michael Adams. I was invited to the unveiling out in the desert near Ridgecrest, where the crash occurred in November of 1967. At the event, there were many people associated with the aircraft who were present. Over the years, it had been fairly easy to find the pilots, the managers, people up there at the top. But on that day, I was finally able to connect with those who worked in the trenches, the mechanics, the technicians, the guys in the rocket shop. I also met other members of Mike's family, which also was critical to tell his story. That opened up a whole new avenue for me and gave me what I've been looking for to properly flesh out the story I wanted to tell. In the end, I interviewed more than 70 people and created over 1,200 pages of transcripts from those interviews. I also had a couple of thousand photos, and they needed to be scanned and color corrected, and our beautiful cat Fluffy was always there to help me in that process. Another aspect of being able to tell the story properly was to get the feel of actual places where all of this had happened. This territory was known as the X-15 High Range. So besides my travels all across the country to research and interview these important people, I made several trips to those locations, from Edwards Air Force Base to the dry lake beds where emergency landings occurred, to get those places to look. That took a lot of research, as no maps existed to show the way. Sometimes it took multiple trips in order to find the right location and how to finally get out there. Here's the Beatty High Range radar site in southern Nevada as it appeared during the X-15 program. There was an easily traversable road in the days of the X-15 to get up the hill from the main highway. However, when I went searching, that road had deteriorated into a jumbled mess. It's a steep dirt road that became inaccessible just halfway up. I carefully drove up as far as I could. Then I had to apply the emergency brake and hike the rest of the way up to the top. I was really hoping my car would still be there when I got back down. I got up to the top, I turned south and walked along the ridgeline to where only the concrete pad remained to identify the site. Once there, I sat down, scanned the valleys on either side of me, and tried to envision what it had been like to work in such a place in the wilderness. I drank some water and munched on some peanut butter crackers before making the journey back down the mountainside to my car, which was luckily still securely parked right where I left her. Since there was no way to turn around on that hill, it was a very slow and careful adventure in itself just to back down off this hill. That was a fun one. Now, the second high range radar site is a much further drive, and it's outside of Ely, Nevada, in the northwestern portion of the state. It is much higher in the mountains than Beatty, and as I found out, it can have snow well into June. Yeah, so again, I couldn't go all the way up. After an 8-mile slog up a precipitous dirt road into the mountains, this is what I encountered, just a mile or so short of my goal. Once again, I had to abandon my car and see how far I could get on foot. As I got nearer, I discovered the site was actually still in use. In the end, I decided the most prudent idea was to only see it from afar, as I had no idea what sort of reception I might receive if I walked in unexpectedly on some classified operation. Now, one location that caused me a lot of consternation was getting out to Mud Dry Lake outside Tonopah, Nevada. This was an important site where 4 of the 12 X-15 emergency landings occurred, including the most serious of these mishaps that you see here when Jack McKay had a near fatal accident on 9 November of 1962. On landing, the left rear skid collapsed and the X-15 rolled over onto its back. McKay was trapped inside. I felt it was very important to figure out what it would take for me to get out there, and it took several attempts for me to do so. My first try to traverse the 14 miles of dirt roads ended when the clouds opened up with a thunderstorm. I needed dry conditions in order to make a safe trek. I certainly didn't want the name of Mud Lake to become a reality for me. On my next attempt, I finally met with success, seeing the vista exactly as it had looked 4 decades previously. Now here's the same spot in 1966 after Bob Rushworth's final X-15 flight ended in another emergency landing at Mud. I considered this a huge accomplishment, yet it was a haunting feeling to be out there by myself on that vast, dry, primeval lake bed. Out of this came a unique perspective on the X-15, one that I wanted to share with others. This led to the creation of an actual tour itinerary, one which people today can now follow in order to visit these places themselves. You'll see the tour that I've created over here on the table. Traveling from where the X-15 was first manufactured at North American Aviation near Los Angeles International Airport to the Antelope Valley where the pilots and others had their homes, to the radar sites and dry lake beds, to the resting places of those people where we can pay our respects for their courage in advancing our knowledge of aerospace, and to revisit the same places that people like Jack McKay went to with his children in the 1960s, such as the beautiful Red Cliffs area where we recreated their iconic image more than a half a century later. The next part of my adventure took me across the country, hunting down the actual X-15 hardware as well as the X-15 mock-ups that were still in existence. One superb mock-up was used in the filming of the only fictional motion picture to feature the X-15, titled, appropriately enough, X-15. The stars included Charles Bronson and Mary Tyler Moore, who showed off her great fashion sense around hypersonic aircraft, high heels and all. This was her first major motion picture. After filming was completed, the mock-up went into storage until being sent to New York for the 1964 World's Fair, where it was on public display for 18 months, and they actually changed the configuration from the standard X-15 to the X-15A2 with the external tanks. On the real vehicle, these would extend its speed range by nearly an entire Mach number, and that's what's shown in the giant model that we have here. The World's Fair ended and the mock-up went back into storage for many years, eventually, however, to be acquired by the Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona, where it still resides today. The U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama was home to an X-15 mock-up for many years before being donated to the Cosmosphere Museum in Hutchinson, Kansas, which specializes in restoration of historical aerospace artifacts. It then received a new paint job, a new tail number, but it never went on display until finally the Evergreen Museum in McMinnville, Oregon expressed interest and gave it an excellent high-flying home where you can see this today. One last mock-up exists, which was a pet project of X-15 pilot Milt Thompson. Once created, it was mounted to a large pole where it resided for many years until a huge windstorm threatened to completely destroy it. It actually buckled the fuselage and they had to take it down. It was brought down and is safely now tucked away on the ground until it finds a safe display position, most likely at the new Flight Research Center Museum being constructed at Edwards Air Force Base. And there were two B-52 motherships that carried the X-15 to altitude for the start of each research mission. Both of these aircraft still survive today. B-52 number 8 has a new home just outside the northern entrance to Edwards Air Force Base, where it served the X-15 and other research programs for decades. This aircraft lofted the X-15 on 106 of its 199 flights. There is a possibility that that X-15 mock-up that Milt Thompson commissioned at Edwards may eventually be installed onto the wing pylon from where the real X-15s were once launched. I can't think of a better place for it to reside. At the propulsion system test facility, the X-15s were bolted into a structure where the rocket engine could be test fired. Between the two test stands was a blockhouse where engineers and technicians would be safe if anything went wrong during the firing. That facility still stands today, although it's now just being used for storage, and the blockhouse has been gutted of all electronic equipment. The test stands themselves, however, appear still ready to accept another X-15 engine firing with little refurbishment. The second B-52 mothership was retired after 93 X-15 missions and was flown to Tucson, Arizona. It now resides at the Pima Air and Space Museum, where it has recently undergone a full restoration. When I visited Pima several years ago during that restoration, I was allowed to climb inside and take a look around. That was pretty cool to be inside that aircraft and know the things that had happened in that aircraft. These are the pilot and co-pilot stations where legendary aviators such as Fitz Fulton once sat as they flew the X-15 to its launch altitude of approximately 45,000 feet. Now, 3 X-15s were built by North American Aviation to conduct a 10-year-long program of hypersonic research. The number 3 aircraft was lost in November 1967 and took the life of pilot Michael Adams. The number 2 aircraft was modified into what was called the X-15A2, as seen here, with those external fuel tanks to extend the range and speed of the aircraft. This vehicle now resides at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. Here it is seen under the nose of the huge Mach 3 experimental bomber, also built by North American Aviation, the XB-70A Valkyrie. The number 1 aircraft was the first to take to the skies on 8 June of 1959, and it performed 81 successful missions during the program through 24 October of 1968. That equates to more than 40% of all flights of the X-15. It now holds a place of honor in American aerospace history, and it resides suspended from the ceiling at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. That museum is well worth the trip just to see this amazing aircraft that flew more than 6 times the speed of sound and higher than 50 miles into space, earning 8 of the 12 X-15 pilots astronaut wings. Now, when I first started my interviews back in the 1980s, pilot Robert White resided over in Germany. We conversed through snail mail. Anybody remember snail mail? Across the Atlantic, but nothing can compare to actually sitting down with someone in person. Bob eventually moved back to the United States and settled in Florida. He was the last X-15 pilot that I was finally able to sit down with in person in May of 2006. Even though I spoke with others after this date, I consider that cross-country trip to see him as the completion of the primary research to get my book written. That had started back in September of 1983, nearly a quarter of a century earlier. At the time, I considered this the culmination of what I'd set out to do, but I had no idea it would be more than another 5 years until the book would be written and nearly 7 years until it would be published. Now, to get the book done required a lot more than just sitting down and writing it all out. I had to find a publisher, and that took me to my friend Francis French. He co-authored the first 2 books in the Outward Odyssey series from the University of Nebraska Press. One day, we met up at a favorite place called Killer Pizza from Mars in Oceanside. If you're ever down there, you have to go to Killer Pizza. It is so cool. He asked me that day if I was still working on my X-15 book. I said yes, but I had no idea where to go from here. He said that the University of Nebraska Press might be interested to have my book as part of this new Outward Odyssey series. Things progressed from there by meeting the Outward Odyssey series creator, Colin Burgess, from Australia. Then, and having to write a book proposal. That was a huge hurdle because at that point I truly had to get things organized. How was I planning to put together this book? What was the goal? How would the chapters be laid out? It got me to finally focus on exactly how this would come together into a coherent story. I knew immediately that I didn't want to just bore readers with a simple standard chronology, but I finally hit upon was to make each chapter into a biography of one of the 12 pilots, with an emphasis on their time in the X-15 program and how they affected the outcome of that program. With Colin's immense help, and once reviewed, my proposal was accepted. But then things got complicated for me, as at the time the contract came through for signing, I was confined to a nursing home after an accident, which cost me 2 severely broken legs. Unsure if I would even walk again, I spent 3 months healing and rehabilitating and sat in my wheelchair to sign the contract that day in February of 2009. At the time, I had grave doubts if I would ever even be able to do the writing, but I moved forward to at least give it a chance to happen. Over the next couple of years, as you can see, I was able to overcome the problems and move forward. I started putting it all together and actually got the writing of the manuscript going, completing the introduction on 8 January of 2011, and my first chapter on February 6th. Exactly 6 months later, and just 1 week behind schedule, I completed the book and got it sent off to the publisher. Those months of writing were a real roller coaster. I got very little sleep and rarely left my desk for more than an hour at a time. I needed to write down all those stories that had been bouncing around in my head for decades. I would write deep into the night, read through it myself. Then when Cherie was awake, which was very little time, I would have to sit down and read it to her. There were times I wrote something I thought was brilliant, but Cherie would never let me get away with anything and always bring me back down to earth. Reading it out loud to her was the best thing I could have done. It ensured that everything made sense and was a great way to catch even small typos and other errors. Colin told me afterward that he had never received a manuscript requiring almost no editing. Now, the last hurdle was to find someone to write the foreword for my book. The person who accepted the challenge was X-15 pilot Joe Engel. He became a good friend, and we did several events together over the ensuing years. It took me nearly 28 years to get to that point from the moment I first decided to write about the X-15, one that I truly thought would never happen. It was a huge relief to know I had accomplished what I'd set out to do way back in kindergarten. I told you I'm OCD. It would be another 20 months until publication actually occurred, but I had my hands full during that time, such as working to put together my website, focusing on the X-15 and the book. And anybody who has a copy of the book, be sure to go to my website. It's at the top of the list of illustrations page. You'll find tons and tons of stuff there. Another aspect I had never even considered as a possibility was creating new artwork that could be used in the book. About 6 years prior to going to print, Tommy Eriksson from Gothenburg, Sweden, dropped me an email to introduce himself. He loved the X-15 and was working on some computer images of the aircraft. I asked if he'd like to do some images from my book, and he was all in. With my ideas and Tommy's skills, we worked together to bring the X-15 to life as it has never been done before. My mandate was to show the X-15 in ways that were impossible to photograph. Here, Tommy shows us what no one else has ever properly depicted: the X-15 in zero gravity, flying in space with experiments deployed, gaining new knowledge for science and exploration, the true purpose of the X-15. And the nickel alloy skin of the X-15, Inconel X, glowing at more than 1,300 degrees during re-entry. I considered Tommy's image, Rocket to Space, as being the perfect book cover. It took me a lot of negotiations to convince the University of Nebraska Press to use this artwork. Since Tommy was an unknown artist, they said they would rather use a NASA or Air Force photograph from the program. I thought that was pretty boring. I insisted that what Tommy had produced was stunning and exemplified the tone of the book as no photograph possibly could. Eventually, they finally relented, and I'm extremely proud of his cover. And I would be remiss if I didn't also mention that Tommy then later used his work in creating these images as the core of his PhD thesis, which he handily and most deservedly received. So that's an extra cool thing that I really love about this book. We actually helped create a new doctor. I wanted to hit the ground running when the book was released, so I developed a talk I could take on the road to help publicize the book, created book cards and flyers, and participated in book fairs. As the time approached for the release of my book, my health again took a major turn for the worse. I developed a serious case of kidney stones, which at one point I truly did not think I would survive. Over the course of a month, I experienced a dozen emergency room visits and multiple surgeries. The timing worked out perfectly, and then on my return home from my last doctor's visit on 17 April of 2013, Cherie and I came home to see a large box sitting at our front door. We immediately knew what it was. Whatever medical problems I had, at that moment, my recovery was complete. I grabbed the box, brought it inside, quickly slicing it open to find my book inside. It was a moment I'd waited for all of my life, actually holding a book in my hand that I had written myself, telling the story I never thought I could tell. To this day, it's something I look at and marvel that I was ever able to accomplish any of it. But it is the thing I'm most proud of outside of the love of my beautiful wife, Cherie. Soon after, Colin was flying into Los Angeles from Australia. We met up at the airport to celebrate. And not long after that, we met up again with Francis to have another great pizza at the place that started the entire publishing process. Without that first conversation with Francis in 2008, the moment of having completed my book might never have happened. 4 days later, visiting the local Barnes & Noble, there was my book on the shelves. The manager asked, and I gladly autographed them for the store. One customer even bought a book right there while I was signing. A long time before all this, a few years after I had started my research, I started giving talks on the X-15. The very first was at Vandenberg Air Force Base in the Central California coast on 23 July 1987 as part of their Space Week celebration. I've been led to believe this would be a high-level talk with officials from the Air Force and other bigwigs, so I prepared with this huge technical slide presentation. Yes, actual slides in a projector in those days. How quaint, right? When everything was set and the audience started to file in, instead of a lot of military uniforms, in walked a bunch of school kids. To say it was a total disaster is one of the biggest understatements I could ever make. I learned a huge lesson that day and have been fortunate to never have a repeat of an event like that. Later that year, I did my talk to the Rockwell Family Night event at Downey Space Division. This is the company that had previously been known as North American Aviation and had manufactured the X-15 back in the late 1950s. This talk went much better and was very well received. One of the first people I interviewed for my book, flight planner Jack Koff, attended that evening, and it was an exciting time. I also included the first display that I created, including models and photographs from the X-15 program. Years later, once the book came out, I developed a whole new presentation based on the manuscript itself, which I've been able to give here at the Western Museum of Flight. And I'm still doing it. This is my 152nd X-15 talk, so thank you all for being here for that. This is based on the benefits of my years of research and includes quotes from many of the people I interviewed. That talk has now carried me throughout the United States and even across the world. I have currently given more than 150 talks in 19 states, 6 countries, and on 5 continents. I never could believe this journey would have ever happened. One of the most amazing locations where I've done my presentation has to be in January of 2023 in Antarctica. The ship had just left the Antarctic Peninsula an hour before as we started back across the Drake Passage toward Argentina. The waves pounded the World Traveler. The Vasco da Gama Theater where I spoke was at the bow of the ship, and water crashed against the hull just yards away under my feet. The waves sent resonant vibrations, causing me to grab onto the podium, which was not bolted to the floor. I was holding on for dear life. After I finished the talk, my palms were literally black and blue with bruises. But apparently everybody loved the presentation, as I had people come up to me and offer congratulations throughout the voyage home, and even at the airport days later when we were waiting for the plane in Buenos Aires. One event I'm most proud of happened in Tucson at Space Fest in 2017. I'd spoken there several times previously on the X-15, but that year I wanted to do something unique. Instead of simply doing a normal talk, I was able to organize a panel discussion which included X-15 pilot Joe Engle, as well as 4 engineers from the program. This is the only time I'm aware of where something like this has ever happened. Even surpassing the experience I would have several years later in Antarctica, those 2 hours with Joe, Wayne, Charlie, Harry, and Vince will probably be the most amazing hours of my life. A close second would be when Joe Engle and I spent the day at the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, doing multiple talks to command staff, instructors, and cadets. We spoke with over 3,000 people that day. Every location and every talk has been a wonderful experience. Here I am at one of my very first talks after the book's publication at Griffith Observatory at the Leonard Nimoy Event Horizon Theater. It's impossible for me to explain just how exciting it is to do these presentations for air and space museums, pilot and engineering organizations, university students, local libraries, civic groups, and community centers. Examples include the Florida Institute of Technology, which included 2 space shuttle astronauts in the audience with Winston Scott and Sandy Magnus, and the Western Museum of Flight, where I have now spoken twice, now my 3rd time. And at my first talk here, I had a very special thing happen. As I was setting up, a man came up to me and said, "I know you've never heard of me, but I worked on the X-15 program. My name is Bob Hayos, and I created the attitude sensor used on the nose of the X-15 when I worked at Nortronics." Even though I'd never actually had the chance to meet him before, I knew exactly who Bob was. I said, "Bob, I know who you are, and you are in my book." He was taken aback, so I grabbed a copy, opened it to the index, and showed Bob his name was listed there. Bob was over 90 years old at the time, and it was a marvelous thing to watch him light up that day. It was just wonderful. He had this giant pile of X-15 stuff he brought, and he let me use it all and copy it and send it back to him. Bob was such a wonderful man. This event was also special in that it is where I first displayed my huge X-15 1/15 scale model. This model was actually at Edwards during the time of the X-15. After the program ended, it was donated to the California Museum of Science and Industry, now known simply as the California Science Center. As it was being delivered, the model was dropped. It broke into many pieces. The fuselage was busted, the tail was gone, the cockpit was gone. It was a mess. The museum thought it was beyond repair. Luckily, however, instead of just throwing it away, they instead locked it into storage where it stayed for over 20 years. When it was uncovered, a docent there, who was a good friend of mine, suggested donating it to me to see if I could put it back together. Amazingly, it went back together. I learned a lot of new modeling skills on this one. It took me a long time, but that finally happened, especially after the efforts of a good friend of mine who is a real master model builder, a guy named John Page Risk. I was invited to Palm Springs to speak at the Palm Springs Air Museum. They not only rolled out the red carpet for me, but actually rolled in an F-104 starfighter that was in their collection and had been used as a chase plane in the X-15 missions. The cockpit was opened up, and I went to have a vicarious and very unexpected experience that day of sitting in the pilot's seat of a Mach 2 fighter plane. I then came back down to earth and gave my X-15 talk on the Bob Hope stage at the museum. In addition to my initial talk, I've developed several other presentations. These include a special talk about pilot Michael Adams, who lost his life during the only fatal accident of the X-15 program. Additionally, I've hosted movie screenings of the 1961 motion picture X-15, as well as showing various documentaries about the research program, such as the great NBC News special from 1981 called The Rocket Pilots. Another very special event was at the Joe Walker Middle School in Quartz Hill in California's Antelope Valley, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the school named in honor of X-15 pilot Joe Walker. I was given the school's gym in order to set up a large display and to give my talks to every class as they cycled in throughout the day. My voice was cracking and almost gone by the afternoon, but amazingly, I made it through all the talks, barely. After each presentation, I invited the students to come up and get a close look at the models, photographs, and X-15 artifacts. Cherie, of course, was by my side that whole day to help. I spoke with literally every student and faculty member as part of this education experience, which also featured NASA pilots, educators, and 12 members of Joe Walker's family. I presented a specially signed copy of my book to the school, which was placed into a time capsule that will be opened by students in 2077. It's a wonderful thought to know that students a half century from now, long after I'm gone, will get to know the story of the amazing people like Joe Walker and his fellow X-15 pilots. Another fascinating experience that has come out of all this is that I'm now being asked to take people on my special tour in the footsteps of the X-15. It includes stops such as lunch at Domingo's restaurant in Boron, where you can have a special drink that will singe your eyebrows called a boron rocket fuel. Yeah. Yeah. Domingo's is close to Edwards Air Force Base and is famous as a place where pilots and astronauts love to drop by, although on this day we only had a two-dimensional Neil Armstrong stop by to say hello. We went by the Edwards North Base entrance to visit the B-52 mothership and then to visit the Cuddyback Dry Lake where they made emergency landings. It's the closest lake bed to Edwards and is where two of those emergency landings occurred. It is vast and wide open terrain, which lends itself perfectly as a place to dance. After Cuddyback, we headed north to a more somber location, the Michael Adams Memorial. There are many monuments in the desert around Edwards to commemorate accidents that have occurred over the decades during flight test research. But there is nothing quite like what we have accomplished to honor Mike Adams. In May of 2004, Eagle Scout John Bedelsky first created this memorial as his community project. A huge crowd came to the desert that day to pay their respects to Mike, and as I mentioned previously, the event was pivotal in my research for completing the book. Over the years, several expansions have taken place, primarily accomplished by Rob Enriquez of the Bureau of Land Management, Bob Klein, and myself. Also provided new display boards to help tell the story of the site. And in November of 2017, a new expansion was unveiled as part of the event honoring Mike on the 50th anniversary of his accident. I also created a new presentation specifically about his life, his work on the X-15, and his legacy. It was first presented at the Matarango Museum in Ridgecrest, about 20 miles north of the crash site. And the following day, there were a couple of hundred people who joined us to learn more about Mike, his life. Domingo himself was there and provided food and drink for everyone present, although no rocket fuel that day. X-15 rocket shop technician Dave Stoddard was with us that day. He had been instrumental in locating the exact site where the accident happened so that that monument could be created. Here he shows us an X-15 artifact recovered from the site. Dave was one of the people I met back in 2004 at the original dedication, and he greatly assisted in connecting me to so many others who worked on the X-15. This image shows two of the 4 large display boards now there I created to tell the visitors about the X-15, the people involved that made it all happen, and about Mike and the accident that took his life. Present that day were 2 representatives of Mike's family, his son Brent and nephew Dave. Immediately following the event, we all went a few miles south to the Randsburg Opera House. This town has a population of just 65 people. Yet that afternoon, we packed the 1885 Opera House to capacity to hear the story of Major Adams and the X-15. Sitting in the front row was Brent and Dave. To say I have never been more nervous about giving a talk would be a severe understatement. I hoped that they would appreciate the story I told of Mike, and afterward I was relieved when they said I had definitely done him justice. I originally thought I would only give this talk once or twice, but today I continue to be asked to give this talk as part of the presentations I do about the X-15. My analysis of the accident has been used by engineering students and also the cadets at the U.S. Air Force Academy now. Over the years since, the Adams site has been expanded exponentially. People have come from all over the world to seek out this spot and pay homage to Mike. We actually have a sign-in book, and you can't believe some of the signatures on there. It is monitored by the BLM as well as myself and many others to protect the legacy of the X-15 and all those who are involved with the program. We've actually been there when people have shown up that apparently go there all the time. We have a guy that comes up from San Bernardino just to make sure everything is properly dusted off and stuff. It's amazing how people have embraced this monument to Mike. Since then, I've been the technical consultant on the movie First Man and also for National Geographic Television's show, The Real Right Stuff. In addition, I had a profile in both the Orange County Register and in Newsweek magazine. The Museum of Flight in Seattle interviewed me for their oral history program. This has all been made possible because of the X-15 and is something that I never envisioned when I started this project back in 1983. I also just went through an oral history project for the Library of Congress. I just get blown away by this sometimes. I'm often asked what book I'm working on next. My answer is always that I spent 30 years out there on my own obsessing over the research and writing of this book about a program that achieved a record speed of 4,520 miles per hour, Mach 6.7. It achieved an altitude of 354,200 feet, that's 67.1 miles high. Now, I can't imagine a more fulfilling thing than to do that, than to be out there talking with a lot of people and sharing the story of the X-15. This is the X-15 rocket plane flying the first wings into space. For me, this adventure is just beginning, and I want to thank you all for being here today to share in this journey. I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you. Yes. Okay, go for it. He asked what the most interesting story that didn't make it into my book was, right? Okay. There's actually a series of stories that I had that had to do with hydrogen peroxide. Some of these guys that worked on that program, they had all these amazing stories about working with hydrogen peroxide. Now, all of you are familiar with hydrogen peroxide. You go to your local CVS or Rite Aid or something, and you get this, it's like 2% hydrogen peroxide. And you might use it on a little cut or something like that. They used 100% hydrogen peroxide. That stuff touches your skin, it burns it off. And oh my God, some of the stories from these guys, it was like, you know, somebody would get it on there. They always had a hose running, like when they were around the test stand and they're having to load the hydrogen peroxide for the test run. And they always had to make sure they had a hose handy because somebody inevitably would get something dropped on them and there'd be a guy right there to just spray them down immediately. And I had just a whole bunch of these stories and I just could not find a place to put it in the book. So it's one of the things that probably bugs me the most, that I couldn't find a place for that. So that was a great question. Nobody's ever asked me that one before. Thank you. Yes. Go for it. Go for it. Well, he asked what Neil Armstrong worked on specifically on the X-15, and he didn't build anything specifically himself, but he was involved with specific programs on the X-15 that he followed through from inception through actually being the first person to fly them. The primary thing that he was responsible for on the X-15, which was critical to the entire program, was a thing called the cue ball, which is the thing that Bob Hayos had designed that we had talked about before. And that's the nose of the X-15 has this ball about, oh, that big around, and it has little holes drilled into it. Most aircraft have like this tube coming out the front. There'll be a strake or something out in front with airspeed indicators and stuff like that. And you can't do that in a hypersonic research aircraft because it would melt off. So they built this thing called the cue ball. And the reason it's called Q is because it's sensing the aerodynamics and stuff, and that's where that comes from Q. And so that was the program that he got assigned, that Neil got part of, and he followed that through its inception and was part of the engineering on it, although he never physically built it. And then he was assigned as the first flight person on the X-15, because the original flights of the X-15 had that standard boom out on the front. But then when they started getting higher end flights, higher speed flights, they had to get rid of that. And so he flew the first 3 flights, I believe it was, on the cue ball, just testing everything out and making sure that it worked as it was supposed to. That cue ball eventually was also critical to the Apollo program in the fact that it was a direct transfer from the X-15 to be put on the top of the launch escape system, the very top of both the Saturn 1B and the Saturn V had the X-15 cue ball on it. So when they launched off the pad at Kennedy Space Center, a piece of the X-15 was literally riding on the very nose, and that's what gave the direction to the rocket as it was heading up into space. So, yeah. Yes?
Thank you for your excellent presentation.
Thank you.
And my question is, when they were testing the
Yes, he asked about the fact that there was a crash of the X-15 where the X-15 broke in half. And that actually was a flight, it was the very third flight, the third powered flight of the X-15 program, and it was flown by Scott Crossfield. And there was a design oversight in the nose gear of the vehicle. And the problem was when he was dropped off the B-52, he ignited the engines and there was a fire that immediately began in the engine compartment. And it just took a few seconds and it actually melted through the jettison tubes, so they could not get rid of any of the fuel on the aircraft either, because if they dumped the fuel out, it would have really caught on fire. So there was no jettison, almost completely full fuel tanks, and he had to get down on the ground as soon as possible. It was the first emergency landing in the X-15 program, and instead of landing at Rogers Dry Lake Bed, which is on Edwards property itself, he landed next door at the Rosamond Dry Lake Bed. And because of that overweight landing, and because of the design oversight on the gear of the X-15, the nose gear, when you come down and hit with the skids, and the second the skids hit, the nose just plops down because the skids are all the way in the back. It's like trying to balance a pencil. And as soon as that nose gear hit, because of the design oversight, the fuselage just buckled. And it buckled about 3 feet behind Scott Crossfield. And it was actually a regular joint where it happened. And so it was relatively easy to fix. They just put it back together. They took it back down to North American, and they put it back together, and it re-entered service just a couple of months later. So it wasn't a real critical thing, but it could have been a lot worse. It definitely could have. Yes. Yes. Sure. Well, he asked how many fuselages there were of the X-15. And the X-15, there were 3 aircraft that were built, number 1, 2, and 3. And although there was an accident on the propulsion system test stand one day, June 6th of 1960, when a fuel explosion occurred on the test stand and basically blew the back half of the X-15 to smithereens. And so luckily they had enough spare parts to rebuild that aircraft. Although I know that's one of the things the mechanics always complained about, and said for the rest of the program, the number 3 aircraft was a real bear to work on, because they had to splice everything from the front end of the aircraft to the back end of the aircraft when they rebuilt it. So there's all these splices, and there was always trouble with that. But so you could sort of say there was basically 3.5 fuselages for the program. Yes. So, yes.
Yeah, I'm just a little aside. Did you have any interaction? I don't know.
Okay, he's asking whether or not there was any crossover with X-15 research to some of the land speed records, like people like Greg Breedlove and stuff like that. As far as I know, they didn't use anything from the X-15. The people that were doing the land speed records, they've gotten over Mach 1 on the ground. That's pretty amazing. Try doing that at 5 o'clock on LA traffic sometime. But it's, they were looking at more at stuff that around the Mach 1 range. So they were, I think they actually used an engine from an F4 Phantom on one of these things. And so they were looking more at those kind of range of aircraft rather than going hypersonic. Doing Mach 6 on the ground would definitely be something else to see. Yeah. Yeah. Yes?
I wonder if you ever had occasion to go out to Salton Sea.
Now that I'd love to see. She's asking if I ever went out to Salton Sea because they, oh, cool. Asked if I'd ever been out to the Salton Sea because they did some rocket sled testings. Now they tested, they have the front end of the X-15, which included the cockpit, a mock-up, and they were testing the ejection seat. And so they'd fire it up on the rocket sled to hundreds of miles an hour and then fire the ejection seat out to make sure that it worked and that theoretically the pilot would survive. The X-15 ejection seat was never actually used in flight. Mike Adams did try to activate the X-15 ejection seat on the fatal flight, but was not able to complete it before the aircraft fell apart because of excessive G loads. But in answer to your question, I haven't been out to where the test tracks were or anything, but it was a really interesting thing to see. There's some movies and lots of still images of those tests and stuff. So yeah, I'd love to see that picture sometime.
Thank you. I didn't even really understand what it meant, the sled runs, and now I understand more.
Yeah, they wanted to get it up as high as possible in speed, but of course they still couldn't get it up as high as they wanted to. The way that the ejection system worked on the X-15 was that they decided that there's no way they could make an ejection seat that could safely operate at Mach 6. And if you're at 350,000 feet or something, so they never even tried to do that. They basically said the X-15 itself will be your protection down to a certain speed and altitude. And so the limits put on the ejection seat were around Mach 4, which is still pretty fast. And so like the ejection seat was very interesting. They were talking about maybe making a capsule, but they didn't go with that way. So they actually had this ejection seat that would pop out. The pilot himself wore his pressure suit, and then over the pressure suit, if you see pictures along here and stuff, and in my presentations, you'll see there is a silver outer layer to the X-15 pressure suit. And that silver layer was there for two things. One, it would protect against the heat, the flash, if they had to be ejected. So you had that silver on there, and it would also be expected that it would probably ablate away and flash away. And again, that would protect the pilot by taking the heat away from him as he fell down and got to a lower altitude. And then the ejection seat itself had these two giant wings that popped out to try to stabilize it. These things were like about 10-foot booms on either side. Really interesting to see that thing when it pops out. And that's all stowed right in there next to him. When he pops out, then these giant wings come out and then hopefully stabilize it and then be able to eject out from there. So yeah, I definitely want to see that. Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, the women on the X-15 were so important. Not only your role as a secretary on the program, but it was also the women were the people who were assigned to handle the data that was gathered on the programs. They were called computers, and they had to plot everything out with their paper and pens and stuff. So without them, everything the X-15 accomplished meant absolutely nothing. So the women, absolutely essential. Thank you. Yes, and there were I actually did a talk, the very first time I ever did this talk, she was asking about X-15 women engineers, and yes, there were some on the program, and the very first time I did this talk was at the Lake Forest Senior Center, which is where I live in Lake Forest, and they asked me to, that's why I developed this talk, because they asked me to do it there. And there were two women in the audience who were X-15 engineers. And that was really cool to get to meet them. And we literally, after the program was over, we sat out in the lobby for like 2 hours talking. It was so wonderful to meet them. And she also was asking about North American Aviation pilot Al White, who was also assigned on the program, but he never got to fly. He was Scott Crossfield's backup pilot, and there was no way in the world Scott Crossfield was ever going to let anybody else get in that cockpit. I mean, really. At one point, Scotty made the suggestion, it's like, I helped design and build this thing, and I know how to fly it better than anybody, so darn it, what do you got all these other pilots on the program for? You only need me. He actually made he made that idea of saying, you know, you don't need anybody else, just let me fly the entire program. But NASA was running the program, and more importantly, the Air Force was paying for the program, along with a little bit from the Navy, and they're like, Scotty, you did the contractor flights, that's fine, it's time to give us the airplane, and let's go on and do our research. Go bye-bye now. So Scotty was a wonderful man, but unfortunately, he just almost made it to Mach 3 in the X-15. That's as far as he got to go, and he certainly never got to fly it into space, and it was really terrible because he deserved more, but there were so many other pilots that needed to fly that as well. So, yeah. And it's too bad that Al White didn't get to fly, because I know he would have. Scotty was talking about how Al was always out there plotting on how to break his legs or something, but luckily he never did that. Yes.
So, talking about pilots, you mentioned Joe Walker.
Yeah.
What a related story with him.
Okay, he asked about pilot Joe Walker. There were pilots from, Scott Crossfield was North American Aviation contractor pilot. We had one pilot from the Navy, Forrest Peterson. The rest of the pilots were Air Force and NASA pilots, and Joe Walker was the very first NASA pilot to fly the program. He was the first person to fly it after Scotty did. And Joe was a really, really wonderful guy. I think you can find it through my website. There's a YouTube video. They actually did, anybody here remember the old TV show, This Is Your Life? With Vince Edwards? Yeah. And they did one on on Joe Walker one time. And it's really cool to watch that. And it really shows the personality of Joe Walker. He was this old, laid-back, relaxed country boy from the backwoods of Pennsylvania. And I have never seen a picture of him when he didn't have a big smile on his face. He was such an amazing guy. And I got to tell you, remember that time I shared at the beginning how I really got my interest in the X-15 because of going up to Edwards, and the first pilot I met was Neil Armstrong. At the time, it's like, who the heck is Neil Armstrong? I don't know who this guy is. But Joe Walker, he's the guy. He was the test pilot at the time. He was the one, that's the guy I wanted to meet sometime. And unfortunately, I never did get a chance to meet him personally. Although my dad did get an autographed picture from him one time when he came up there, when he did a trip that I didn't go on with him. So that was very cool of him to do that. So yeah, Joe was just wonderful, and it was just such a horrible, horrible thing when he died in the accident with the XB-70. He was flying a chase plane on an F-104, and they wanted him to move in a little closer, and the F-104 got caught in the wingtip vortex of the B-70, and it took his F-104 and just tossed him right over the top of the B-70. It rolled back across, it broke into 3 pieces and exploded. It killed him instantly. It was a terrible, terrible situation. The one good thing that came out of it was that up until that point, nobody really understood the idea of how dangerous wingtip vortexes were. And because of what happened to Joe, it was a terrible price to pay, but now we understand a lot more about wingtip vortexes. And that's why we have separation and stuff for takeoffs, landings, approaches, and things like that that we didn't have before. So, yeah, Joe was a great guy, and he and Jack McKay and Mike Adams, all 3 were gone, by the end of the program, and it was just a terrible loss. I'm just honored that I was able to tell the story of the other 9 pilots, their families, and especially the managers, the flight planners, the mechanics, the guys in the rocket shop. I wish all of you could see, I've never uploaded it to YouTube, but like that time that I did that interview with 17 guys sitting in one room, and the stories that they told. Now the stories are in the book, and I've got the video of that, where one guy started a story. And then the next guy would pick it up, and the next guy would pick it up and say, well, no, this is what happened. And then just back and forth. It's just such an amazing time to be able to talk to these guys. And that's why I wanted to make sure to dedicate this to people like Charlie, who just passed away, because it's people like him that really made it all happen. So, yeah. Yes?
Last question. What happened with Mike Adams' flight? What was the reason for the crash?
This is the final question. He's asking about Mike Adams and what happened in the crash. It was a terrible situation. What it came down to was that there was an electrical disturbance on the aircraft because an instrument, an experiment actually, that was installed in a tip pod out on the left wingtip had been installed, and it had never been properly tested in a vacuum. And so when they got up at high altitude, he had 266,000 feet that day, which earned him a set of astronaut wings. And the instrument started to arc. The electrical system started to arc in the vacuum, and they'd never seen that before. And the arcing that was occurring would run through the whole electrical system of the X-15, so much so that it was knocking out the computer system in the program or in the aircraft. And the fact was that this thing was knocked out and reset, like something like 30 times over the course of just a few minutes as Mike was fighting to get this thing back operational. Then the second thing that happened was that they had this one little instrument right in the center of the instrument panel. And somebody had come up with this brilliant idea of making that instrument do multiple things, depending on where you had a switch put. And because of all the distraction that was going on, because of this electrical disturbance, he misread that instrument. And that was a critical thing to do, because he had the thing switched into yaw mode, which is side to side. He thought he had switched it back to pitch, which is up and down, and he did not realize it was in yaw. And so as he's trying to set up for reentry, he was looking at this thing, and the whole thing with this, it was just a simple thing with a needle. And the idea was all he had to do was keep that needle centered. And he kept trying to center the needle, and he thought he was out in pitch, like the pitch was up or the pitch was down, and he's trying to bring it back to center for his reentry attitude. But in reality, it was the yaw of the aircraft that was coming out. And so he'd be firing the reaction jets to try to bring it in pitch, and instead he was knocking it out in yaw. And what eventually happened is he kept fighting it, so much so that the X-15 literally turned 180 degrees and was facing with the back end of the aircraft into his line of flight. And he went into reentry backwards. And as soon as he started biting into the air, it started a hypersonic spin on the X-15. It's a thing that's happened exactly once in aviation history, and that's a hypersonic spin. Nobody else before or since has ever had such a thing. And the G-forces, we believe, knocked him out. But then the aerodynamics of the X-15 itself actually are so good that when he got into deeper atmosphere, the X-15 actually righted itself. And we don't know for absolute certainty, but we're pretty sure that he did regain consciousness. And what happened was then he grabbed the controls, trying to regain control of his flight, and he ended up causing a pilot-induced oscillation, which started porpoising the X-15 up and down and up and down, and it exceeded the limits of the X-15, and the fuselage broke apart, and that's what killed him. And as I say, the remains landed there at that spot near Ridgecrest, and that's where the memorial is now. And it was a terrible, terrible thing, just a chain of events. It shows us, we always talk about this with accidents, where a chain of events, if you break one chain, you can stop it from happening. And this was just one chain that just did not have a stop to it. And it's one of the analyses, as I said, I did in my book that showed that they didn't learn anything, unfortunately, from his accident, because a lot of the same mistakes were made many years later on the flight of the Challenger when we lost the first space shuttle. And then those mistakes were repeated again in 2003 when we lost Columbia. So it's one of the things I did in my book was to try to analyze all three of those accidents and put those together. And we hope that we have learned some of those lessons finally now. Luckily, there's not been another loss of a manned spacecraft since 2003, but it was a terrible, terrible price to pay. So, yeah. Anyway, thank you all for coming today. It was wonderful to talk to you. Thank you for the great questions. It was great. Thank you. Thank you so much.